Is developing very closely, especially on the sidelines of the G20 summit as well. Will the two meet, which is President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi? Meanwhile, three of the world's most powerful navies will be displaying their sea might in the Malabar exercise in the Indian Ocean. India's military might will be compounded by hefty ships from the US and Japan, while China watches with a very keen eye. Here's what to expect.
I'm telling you again, there's no delay. Please, don't use force.
Anger, threats, intimidation. As India and China are engaged in a tense eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation at their land border in the east, there is a bigger churn taking place in the Indian Ocean region. Four days from now, China will watch from the sidelines as the region's most significant military drill begins in the Bay of Bengal. The 21st edition of the Malabar series of joint naval exercises kick off on the 10th of July, with the navies of India, Japan and the United States deploying their largest warships. China has no part in this exercise except to snoop on the enormously symbolic exercise, whose chief message appears pointed directly at Beijing. Washington describes the exercise as a series of complex high-end war-fighting exercises conducted to advance multinational maritime relationship and mutual security issues. It is no coincidence that one of the overarching regional ties that bind India, the US and Japan is adversarial suspicion of China's long-term intentions. No one to sit back and let the sea be churned in its intended backyard. China has sent a surveillance ship, the Haiwang Xiang, to keep tabs on the Malabar exercises. As India Today reported earlier this week, a Chinese submarine has also been probing the Indian Ocean, likely lurking for more data as the world's most advanced warships enter the area for the India-led exercise. The formidable heavy hitters at the Malabar exercise include the US Navy's flagship nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Nimitz, the guided missile cruiser, USS Princeton, the guided missile destroyers, USS Harvard, Shoup and Kidd, the PA-8 Poseidon aircraft and a Los Angeles-class fast-attack submarine. A total of 15 warships, 2 submarines and scores of fighter jets, surveillance aircraft and helicopters are expected to take part in the exercise. The Indian Navy will be fielding its biggest ship, the aircraft carrier INS Vikramaditya, for the first time in a military exercise. It is certain that China, which has a far bigger navy than India, will employ every asset possible to listen in on the Malabar exercise, to snoop electromagnetic stealth and coding data of the three nations' warships. One thing is clear: as the Doklam standoff simmers, things are about to hot up indefinitely between India and China. With Shiv Arur, Bureau Report, India Today.
Well, the standoff between the two countries have already reached a high point, and in midst of this rising rhetoric, the question is, can India and China actually afford a short-term conflict? Forget about a long-term one. Other questions that need to be asked. Will the Modi and Xi Jinping talks not happening now, with what at least seems to be, add to the tension which is already on an all-time high between the two countries back home? Meanwhile, with what we've been witnessing in the kind of commentary and language, are bilateral ties now, at least for the time being, in deep freeze? And is the border standoff that we are seeing to be a long-haul situation? Joining me on this debate is Shrikant Kodapalli, Professor of Chinese Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. We are also joined by Rajiv Dogra, former diplomat, Major General Harsha Kakkar, defense expert. In the studio with me, Vidya Shankaraya, Foreign Affairs Analyst, and Lieutenant General B.S. Jaswal, defense expert. Let me come down to you, Mr. Jaswal. You know, there's so much been said, something which was also started by our own defense minister, where he went on to suggest that we are no longer in the 1960s. Things are very, very different right now. But the question is, are we actually in a place where we can even afford a short-term conflict with China, forget about a long-term one?
As a matter of fact, let me assure you that the kinetic option by China is very, very unlikely to be exercised. The only actions which it can take on ground is either nibbling or posturing or occupation of certain disputed areas which are not held by us. Otherwise, as far as the troop to ground ratio is concerned, he may have 3 times our army, etc. But what he requires out there to capture our areas requires 1:12.
All right.
Absolutely right. That the attrition ratio will be so high that they better remember 67, not 62.
All right. You know, General Jaswal, I want to bring in Vidya here. You know, Vidya, there is talk about this, that we are no longer what we were, you know, in the 60s. Why do you reckon that we're just not prepared for any sort of conflict right now, and diplomacy should be the only way forward?
Well, the best thing in India's interest is that we don't have a conflict, either short-term or long-term, with China. The reasons are simple. The timing is entirely wrong as far as the Indians are concerned. Consider this for a moment. We've just rolled out the GST on the 1st of July. We're looking at the economy growing. We're talking about a 7.1% GDP growth despite the problems of demonetization. India is reaching out to the world in an unprecedented fashion. Prime Minister Modi gets a reassurance from President Trump in the US that things are all right in South Asia and the relations between India and the US. Now, you want to go past this by having a conflict that you cannot control between India and China, whether it is locally or whether it's in a larger framework. But think about it also. We are talking about nuclear weapons on both sides, the Chinese side and the Indian side, which are not helping you at all whatsoever. You're talking about the Chinese submarines and ships moving into the Indian Ocean, but you also have your own joint exercises with the US and Japan there. So what you're doing is actually moving one pawn and finding the Chinese move another pawn. Why did they pick Bhutan? Because the pacts between India and China on border skirmishes wouldn't apply there directly to Bhutan. They apply certainly to the areas that are relevant to India and China bilaterally. Therefore, this would not be a great time at all. And consider another thing. At 7:30 this evening at the United Nations, there would be a treaty adopted that will completely legally prohibit all nuclear weapons. Now, this will have repercussions in itself on relations between nuclear weapon states or any conflict. So therefore, I would strongly suggest that diplomacy must be deployed in every possible manner. And at best, what you can consider is maybe the Indian troops continue to stay there. Maybe the military standoff continues to remain unarmed. But maybe you can just continue that and maintain that for a while. But do not raise the rhetoric or the temperature of this conflict any further, forcing the hand of either the Indian Prime Minister or the Chinese President to consider any other military ways of resolving this conflict. We can either live with the problem for a while, wait it out and see how things develop, or we certainly don't have the choice of pushing the military button in any way.
All right, let me go across to Shrikant Kodapalli, Professor of Chinese Study at the JNU. You know, Mr. Kodapalli, at this point of time, with what we're seeing where the Malabar exercise is concerned, you know, display of military might, military muscle, with what we're seeing China conducting high altitude exercises, how do you actually pave the way of diplomacy here, where both countries can actually save face and walk away with a fair bit of self-respect, where they are not perceived to be one backing out before the other?
Well, as far as the Sikkim-Bhutan standoff is concerned, there could be de-escalation by introducing CBMs, confidence-building measures. A border personnel meeting is possible between the two armies in terms of looking at what they call as intrusion or transgression in these areas. India has genuine concerns in the region, and also with its special relations with Bhutan since 1910-1947 and reiterated in 2007. So it has some obligations for the Bhutanese security. So in other words, there is a context for this. As far as the Indian Ocean is concerned, there are some concerns for India. This is reflected in the submarine visits by the Chinese to Colombo port and Karachi previously in 2015, and recently in the last, say, few months, where a number of vessels have been seen in this area. Now, since 2008, China had been dispatching naval contingencies as part of the Gulf of Aden counter-Somali piracy operations. However, since the piracy incidents have declined in Indian Ocean, there is no longer the necessity for the Chinese to conduct such operations in the Indian Ocean. In fact, the piracy incidents have increased in South China Sea and Southeast Asia. So there must be more focus on that region rather than on the Indian Ocean. So in other words, there are concerns which have to be addressed by both sides.
All right, Mr. Dobra, do you want to come in as a former diplomat? You know, with the rhetoric has never been this strong. How do you actually maneuver diplomatically in this situation where at least India, which has taken a firm stand, is not blinking, can dial down the situation right now, dial down the kind of, the rhetoric that is going on, and walk away from this situation with a fair bit of self-respect considered, and so does China? What is the way out from here?
Well, you're absolutely right. What is the way out, and how should we scale down the temperature or the tensions? Because war is in no one's interest, nor are skirmishes. Fortunately, neither war nor skirmishes have taken place so far. What has been happening is push and shove. Let's hope that also doesn't happen. But the fact of the life is that there have been nearly 200 incursions by Chinese which have been recorded this year. That means one incursion every day. The fact of the matter also is that it is China which has been upping the rhetoric and upping the temperature all along ever since Mr. Modi's visit to USA. Whether there was some connection with that is a different issue. But I think we need to also realize that we cannot keep on blaming ourselves for every mistake made by China. So you talked of self-respect. A self-respecting country should also stand up for its rights. And there is a limit to how much India can be pushed back. So I think one thing that must be clear is that we must stop this habit of blaming ourselves for the others' mistakes. The second thing is, how do we scale it down? Now, as I said earlier, we have an extremely capable ambassador in China who's wise, who's experienced, and who's at the job. Besides him, there is also the mechanism of the two armed forces talking to each other at some border point. And India has already made a request. One meeting has been held. Beyond that, there are also the mechanism at the Foreign Secretary and NSA level. That can also be initiated, and hopefully there will be some solution found.
All right, gentlemen, well, that's all the time I have for. I'm afraid we've got to wrap up this edition of News. Thank you for joining us this morning.